Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Lots of great information for you this week on our last show of April. Glad you could be here. Before we start, I do want to mention, as United States and global health officials continue to address the spread of COVID-19, UNL is also monitoring the situation. Updates can be found at covid19.unl.edu and on the Market Journal website. Beginning our broadcast, as food production is classified as essential and should continue during the coronavirus pandemic, day-to-day procedures and the way we plan for the future will be much different in our current climate. That's why Nebraska Extension is offering some tips and advice on how to best manage your approach to dealing with this new normal. Market Journal's Bill Dodd has more.
Moving forward in one of the busiest times of year for ag producers during a pandemic is anything but business as usual. This situation will inevitably require that agricultural professionals will now have to carefully consider exactly how COVID-19 could impact their operations on a daily basis and even into the future. One of the most important things we need to keep in mind is what we already know of how the disease is transmitted from host to host. The best way to do that is to stay informed on the ever-changing updates to guidelines set by health professionals.
CDC is really probably the primary place to go get information about how to protect yourself. There's a lot of state and local information that's becoming available. A lot of local health departments are putting in specific guidelines for areas, and it's important to check in with them to make sure that in the particular area you live in, that you're following the recommendations that are appropriate for the area. There's lots of variability in how this outbreak is affecting people. We can see that from watching the news. Thankfully, here in Nebraska, with some exceptions, there's some hot spots that are definitely really troublesome, but we're already spread out, and I think the health departments are putting recommendations in place that help us cope with the need to follow those social distancing and some of those hygiene things, but also takes into account that we live in a little more spread out area than, say, New York City.
It would also be advisable to place products that promote hygiene, such as hand sanitizer, disinfectant materials, such as wipes, and using disposable covers on porous surfaces, such as seats and other upholstered surfaces. Furthermore, it would be prudent to allow a 3-hour downtime in commonly shared areas in order for the virus to expire in confined spaces when possible. Above all, it's important to do your best at keeping high-touch areas as clean as humanly possible.
The reason it's important to clean those things is because the research that's out there right now is showing that the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 can survive on non-porous surfaces for quite a long time, and even some porous surfaces like cardboard. So it can survive on plastic for probably 3+ days is what the data is looking like right now. On wood and metal, maybe even a little bit longer than that. But in general, it survives quite well in the environment for a period of time. So the idea with cleaning high-touch surfaces is that if a particular individual is shedding, that we're going to shut that transmission to the next operator or user of that tool or piece of equipment or whatever down. Some surfaces are almost impossible to clean. For instance, like a seat. It would be very difficult to clean and disinfect a seat. However, it's also a little bit less likely that someone's going to touch different parts of the seat and then touch their face. It's very likely they're going to touch the steering wheel and then touch their face or something like that.
It's paramount that producers put a plan in place to keep distance between teams, family members, and hired personnel to help reduce the risk of transmission from person to person. This includes things like breaking up duties among employees, holding virtual meetings when possible, and most importantly, however, is the need to plan ahead in the event that the owner-operator or any employees fall ill. In this situation, it's highly advisable to put in place a chain of command, so to speak. Nebraska Extension's Tyler Williams explains how new crop and cow-calf operation plans offered by Nebraska Extension can be a useful tool to do just that.
Sometimes things change between when you make that plan and when it actually happens. So if you think like the first person you had planned might either one, be sick themselves, or two, might just have too much on their plate to take on any more land or any other responsibilities. And so that might go down to the next person in line that may have the time to do that, for whatever circumstances that might be thrown their way. So thinking about at least a couple options sort of kind of covers some of the scenarios that are always possible out there.
One of the scenarios that's possible is you may have to rely on people with less experience. And Brian tells me in many scenarios, there are two things you need to remember when you have people on deck to cover for others: training and adjustments.
One, you might have to train that person to some extent. We used an example of a feed truck driver, right? Driving a feed truck in a feedlot it requires a great deal of precision. Those folks have to deliver feed very accurately. They have to spread it out in a bunk well, and they have to be on time. So that may require some training about how to run the feed truck to accomplish that for someone who hasn't done it much or who hasn't done it at all. And it may also warrant a little bit of modification of how cattle get fed to make sure that if they do make a mistake, it's not as big of a deal. So changes in the diet might be, they don't have to be big, but maybe just to compensate for someone who doesn't have as much experience.
As planting season gears up and the workload increases for many in the agricultural industry, it could be very easy to overlook many of the steps we now must take in order to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe and healthy. So, as plans to do business continue to be made, just try to keep in mind the situation we currently face is anything but business as usual. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. Let's get a look at the markets now. And Monday brought quite the shock to the oil market when the May contract went into the negative. Now, this is the first time that's ever happened since oil futures started trading back in the early 1980s. There's been a slight recovery, but we are in unprecedented territory. Luke Beckman of Central Valley Ag joined me Wednesday morning to make sense of it all.
Troy, I think that the demand destruction over the last 60 days has been pretty well documented. Everybody knows what's going on. As it relates to crude oil, you really have to think of crude as having a finite storage capacity. It's not like corn, it's not like soybeans, wheat. Those commodities can be put in temporary storage, most often in piles just on the ground. Crude oil, we don't have that capability. And so essentially what happened in the crude oil market is it was a paper squeeze. Somebody was long paper oil coming into this week. And when you get into that situation, liquidity becomes a little bit of an issue because when you're in the delivery period, somebody has to have storage capacity somewhere to take delivery on that commodity. And, with May futures now expired for WTI crude, June takes the front month, and we can't rule out that could happen again, with June crude as well.
What are some things this instability means for the producers at home watching, and are there any impacts that this will have on their input decisions or their farm management decisions?
Well, we push, in excess of 5.4 billion bushels of corn every year into ethanol in the ethanol space, and corn, became an energy product in the 2000s as ethanol production ramped up. So it absolutely impacts, our farmers, and they know that as well. It's going to provide for some cheaper energy opportunities. We're really just seeing a reset in commodity prices and both corn and soybeans. And, that's going to impact input prices further down the line. From an input side, they're already seeing urea values reset, further out on the curve. So the whole marketplace just has to adjust down, with everything that's happening. And it'll happen from inputs all the way down to, the price of corn that producers receive at the elevator or the processing facility. So it's really something that, we've not seen before, and because of that, we don't know exactly how to act. We're making those decisions the best we can as we navigate through this.
All right, let's put a pin in oil for now and move on to issues with the supply chain. That's something we've been talking about on the show for the last few weeks. So pork plant closures, they've had the potential to throw a wrench in a lot of things. Now, new COVID infections, even at some Nebraska plants. Anything else that you're tracking producers should be aware of on that front?
Well, yeah, it goes back to, slaughter numbers and just looking at, some of the data out earlier this week, cattle slaughter down, 20 some percent year over year. We have facilities up in Canada that are closing down, that represent a big share of cattle slaughter capacity. I got word of another Tyson plant in Iowa this morning that was shutting down for the same reasons. And so, you start to question, how's that going to impact feed demand, of course, on the corn balance sheet. It's pretty easy to see the impacts in soybean meal and DDG, over the last 30 days. And so a month ago, the USDA updated their balance sheet and they acknowledged the ethanol problem. They cut 375 million bushels off the balance sheet right away. Applaud them for making that recognition. And feed demand was bumped in large part because the stocks report at the end of March was, indicated that should happen. You're really going to question feed demand going forward for the rest of old crop. It's going to be really hard to quantify that, Troy. We're probably not going to get any really good insight into that until we see the stocks report at the end of June. But all of a sudden you've added, 500 to 600 million bushels of lost demand onto the 19 and 20 carryout. And for producers to quantify that in their minds, just think of it this way. For the corn crop they're planting right now, that's going to equate to 5 to 6 bushels to the acre nationally for this corn crop. So we have to shave 5 to 6 bushels per acre off of the crop we're growing right now just to get back to par, to pre-COVID levels. So a lot of crop issues would need to pop up to really make up for the lost demand and to get the balance sheet back to the point where we can support, futures around $4.
Yeah, a lot of work to be done. And finally, Luke, one more question. We'll let you go. Just curious as to a couple of the big questions you've been getting from folks over the last few weeks and what's some of the main advice that you've been offering.
Right now, if a lot of producers are asking questions about what to do with old crop corn. It was, as of right now, Wednesday, it was optimistic to see corn defend support from 2016 at 301 on the May futures, and we rebounded off of that. If we can confirm a reversal, we can start to plot retracement levels and where we should be sellers. Farmers need to lower their expectations in terms of what they can expect to sell their old crop grain for. And the other thing to watch is basis, Troy. Ethanol is running at 50% of capacity right now. And so every day we're losing demand. It's that grain's not going anywhere. Really get a little bit concerned about what basis would look like the last half of this summer. If everybody's delaying that marketing decision now because of, poor prices, it just kind of backs everything up. And if farmers want to, deplete their inventory to get ready for harvest this, late summer, there could be a lot of grain that needs to find a home, late summer. So I would not carry a lot of physical basis risk past the 4th of July this year. If you can see basis firm up, I think you need to lock that portion in and maybe price your futures independent of that. So that'd be an idea on old crop corn. I think new crop, if we can get these futures back into the 370s, we should have expanded carries this year with a big crop. Those should be opportunities for producers to be pulling the trigger. $4 feels like a long ways away, and we're going to need some major crop issues to get back there. Soybeans present a more diverse array of possibilities. Yield can have a lot to say about where the carryout ends up on soybeans. So, have your orders in on the beans. We can't rule anything out at this point, but $9 harvest cash is a ways away today, but I still think it's a possibility for a lot of people.
Next week, we'll be joined by Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners. Next up, as farmers head into the fields to start planting, we checked in with Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems for an update on corn and soybean diseases that she's expecting to see in 2020.
Well, every year we caution producers, we have a lot of acres to get over, and, the soil temperatures are still pretty cool in a lot of areas. And we should just keep in mind that even though corn can germinate and soybeans too at 50 degrees, that's well below optimal. And so in many cases, it helps us from the disease perspective to plant when conditions are a little bit warmer. And so if they're forced to plant during cool, wet conditions, just know your chances of getting some of those seedling diseases early in the season in both corn and soybean are higher, and that they should monitor for areas where they're not getting good emergence, or they may have pre-emergent or post-emergent damping off caused by the common seedling diseases like Pythium if it's been wet, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, and in soybean, Phytophthora has been a big issue the last several years too. In the weeks following that, there's a number of things that we'll be watching for. In soybean, I mentioned Phytophthora as a soybean disease, but that disease can kill soybeans all the way through the season, even adult plants late in the season. And so if you've had a problem with Phytophthora, it's still there. And anytime you have low wet conditions or wet soils for a long time, we have a risk for that. In addition, though, there's other things that we're watching, and on the corn side, early in the season, we have seen some development of bacterial leaf streak. We've confirmed that disease, in fact, in I think 74 counties now. And so if they see lesion development on lower leaves that's between the veins, looks a little yellow to tan, streaking, that might be what that is. And don't mistake that for the fungal disease gray leaf spot. And if they have any questions, I hope they'll send in samples to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic. And we know that there's a new disease called tar spot. And this disease in corn was first reported and was a big problem in Central America. Well, in 2015, that disease developed in northern Indiana and northern Illinois. And for the first 3 or 4 years, it didn't do very much. It didn't cause much yield loss. It didn't spread very far. But in the last 2 years, in 2019 and 2018, when we had wetter conditions and cooler growing conditions, well, those are optimal for that disease, and it spread much further and faster, and it was severe. In some of those fields, they required fungicide applications for mitigation, and also it caused up to 50% yield loss in the worst cases. It's not common, but we've watched that disease move closer to Nebraska, and it's within 1 county of us in western Iowa, and we hope everyone in the eastern counties especially will be on the lookout for they look like black dots on leaves, and those are the fungal structures caused by the fungus that causes tar spot. It literally looks like someone splattered paint or black paint or tar on these leaves. And we want to monitor for it because it will overwinter and it'll develop year after year. And we want to monitor its severity and let people know in those counties that it has moved into the state. So that's one thing for sure I'd watch for in 2020.
In the April Nebraska Farmer, Tamra and BASF Technical Service Representative Brady Kapler have more on this topic and discuss diseases that have the potential to show up in Nebraska or are already increasingly present in the state. Time now for a check on the weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And he joins us again this week from his remote weather office. Al, we're preparing to wrap up another month. What are we seeing in the forecast?
Well, Troy, we actually are getting toward the end of the month, and this last week has been a very welcome relief from the very cold weather that we received in the middle of the month. And in fact, soil conditions have been more perfect in the last couple of years, as we've seen here most of southern Nebraska, where we have been a little bit drier than normal, both in the short and a little bit in the medium term. So kind of look as at a benefit when you consider to the east of us, they're going to be dealing with a lot of precipitation over the next few days. And here in the central United States, we are looking at very optimistic planting weather, at least going forward for the next 10 days before we start to look at a more sustainable active pattern going into the first full weekend of May. So as we look at today's forecast, as you can see from this morning's models, the upper air pattern indicates that a large broad trough over the eastern Corn Belt, this was response to the system moved through the state late in the week, is deepened over the Great Lakes, bringing cold air into the region. Low pressure at the surface in southern Ohio, bringing a lot of moisture from the Gulf up into the region. It's going to considerably halt planting issues there for a few days as we have some very cold weather. In our region, we're basically looking at ridging patterns starting to develop this weekend and building into our region, bringing warmer temperatures as the weekend progresses. And we'll see low pressure surface development in western portions of the state, but there's really no moisture for it to work with, maybe a few clouds. And then we kind of flatten the flow out, kind of west-northwest flow, Give us some downsloping winds on Monday from the west. That should be some very nice conditions across the state. We'll be well into the 70s statewide. There is just an outside chance for a few showers to pop up from the central and eastern Nebraska. Don't think it's going to be anything major or cause any problems. But more importantly, on Tuesday, we do see a big ridge developing to the west and energy coming down the front side of that ridge. That will give us a shot of showers statewide. The question is how much of that moisture, as the main emphasis of the heavier precipitation, stays to our north. But it does give us a chance of showers. And on Wednesday, we start to see that ridge building in, the trough deepening over the east, big low pressure over Lake Ontario is going to give very wet, cool weather once again to the eastern Corn Belt, heavy precipitation from the southeast up into the east. You can see that we're high and dry here in the Central Plains, and we really start to warm up on Thursday as a big ridge builds into the southwestern United States and moves that ridge up toward the northern plains. Even though low pressure is shown to develop in southwestern portions of Nebraska, there's just really no moisture to work with. So mostly showing showers down in Texas. We start to see some of that ridging beam deep down a little bit as a trough comes in the western United States. So maybe a little bit cooler as we get to the later part of next week. And one piece of energy coming out into western portions of Kansas may touch off a few showers. But more importantly, as we get into next weekend, we might see that trough moving ever so closely to us. And if it does, then we'll start an increase in precipitation. The next 8 to 14 day forecast from next Tuesday, the following Tuesday, does keep the warm air in the United States and the cold air locked firmly into the northeast. So it's very favorable, at least in terms of soil temperatures not getting too cold. And in terms of precipitation, although there's a dry forecast, I would caution you that as we get into the first full weekend of May, there are increasing signs that we will start to see energy coming out into the central United States, increasing our chances for precipitation. So Troy, overall, it looks like we are going to see a very favorable outlook in terms of planting. Now, the biggest issue will be precipitation going forward. There are numerous chances, but there is just no overall broad-scale heavy precipitation forecasted for the next 10 days. I expect to see a lot of planting going on, so everybody keep safe out there, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Al. We wanted to end the show today with an interview about beef production and how that ties in with global sustainability. Now, not too long ago, I spoke with Robin White of Virginia Tech's Department of Animal and Poultry Sciences. I started by getting some information from Virginia Tech's 2019 Global Agricultural Productivity Report. And according to that study, ag productivity growth is increasing by 1.6%. But that may not be enough.
So the projections are based on our global population growth, and at this point we need to increase agricultural productivity to be able to meet the demand for that growing global population. And the preliminary results would suggest that we need to increase the rate of productivity to be able to meet that gap.
And where would you say growth is stronger and where is it weaker?
I think the GAP report itself and the team involved in that's probably the best resource for that. Certainly I can speak from the animal sector, and animal agriculture is highlighted as a really exciting area where we can start to improve environmental impact of livestock or of agricultural systems, and at the same time work toward this idea of feeding our growing global population.
Yeah, because a lot of that ties into sustainable beef production. What are some things that will be a big focus in the beef industry in the coming years?
That certainly depends on whether you're talking nationally or globally, but I think our beef production system here in the U.S. is going to try and continue our trends in improving productivity and developing the most environmentally friendly products that we can. Historical estimates suggest that the environmental impact of beef production in the U.S. has decreased dramatically as we've improved efficiency of our production systems, and I think moving forward that's a big emphasis that will continue to try and maintain that trend. Another thing that I think the beef industry is becoming more aware of is the need to communicate with people about the environmental impact and the healthfulness of beef products, because our understanding in that area is evolving pretty quickly. And certainly the average consumer probably doesn't have the most up-to-date information.
And I believe you were quoted in an article, I found this interesting, where you said that if animal ag were to decrease, then the increases in the other areas may not be that beneficial. So if you could explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, so we have some work evaluating what would happen if we removed animal agriculture from the U.S. production system in terms of human edible nutrients and in terms of environmental impact. So what we see is, it should be fairly logical. If we remove animals from agriculture, we can then feed people the feed that animals currently consume. But when you do the math on that, the type of feed that animals currently consume is not the type of feed that most humans probably want or need. It tends to be high energy, low micronutrient food products. Whereas livestock products provide low energy, high micronutrient products. So livestock provide this opportunity to kind of condense micronutrients in low energy foodstuffs, which is a really important way to be able to obtain micronutrients in the human diet. The other important outcome of that investigation was related to how environmental impact of the production systems might change. So because of the kind of counterbalancing effects of a change in an agricultural ecosystem that's really evolved to have both crop and animal-based agriculture, we see on a national scale something like a 2.9% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions associated with removing animals from agriculture. That's probably a lot less than what we would infer based on the carbon footprint numbers thrown around for beef in particular.
And in your opinion, I think this answer can go in a million different directions, but say we're looking 50 years down the line, what do you think people are eating and what does that farm of the future look like to you?
You know, I will kind of hedge on that answer a little bit based on the fact that humans are omnivores. And I think over time what we learn is that extremes in any direction are kind of negative in terms of our health. And I think human health will always be the primary driver of human diets. And so I would imagine we're going to move toward diets that our physiology can sustain. And so that's probably a diet that includes animal products, a diet that includes plant products, and a diet in moderation.
Do want to mention, I spoke with Robin before the current pandemic. That's the explanation for the lack of social distancing that you see in that interview. You can find a link to the report that we were talking about on the Market Journal website. That's going to do it for this week's show. Remember, if you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media so you can join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.